Okay, thanks for coming today, everybody. I want to address the issue of the protests and demonstrations at post-secondary institutions that have occurred in recent weeks, and specifically, the situation we worked collaboratively with the University of Calgary on throughout the day yesterday. Demonstrations related to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East have been taking place in recent weeks at post-secondary institutions across Canada and the U.S. Protests and interest groups have adopted the tactic of making a series of demands of post-secondary institutions, then establishing encampments and occupying areas of those institutions, and then refusing to leave until the demands are met. Here in Calgary, we anticipated that when the weather improved, there was a very high likelihood that we would see similar tactics occurring here locally. CPS engaged in conversations with post-secondary institutions in Calgary to discuss potential scenarios and to ensure everyone was clear about the responsibilities and legal authorities for the types of situations that could take place on post-secondary institutions here in Calgary. Several days ago, the University of Calgary sent a notice to students indicating that they would allow peaceful protests to occur on the U of C grounds, but would not allow structures or encampments to be erected per their bylaws. Early yesterday morning, individuals arrived at the U of C and began to erect tents and build an encampment in contravention of the direction that was provided. The individuals were asked to leave by U of C staff, however, some refused to do so. In fact, more people arrived, and more structures and fortifications, including wooden pallets, were added to strengthen the position. It was clear to all involved that the intention was to build an encampment to occupy the U of C, and organizers were clear about their intentions and had conveyed their lists of demands to the university. By mid-afternoon, CPS was contacted for assistance. Unlike protests on public property, when these situations occur on private property, the police are often called upon to assist in removing trespassers or those that are unlawfully on the property after they've been asked to leave. While this situation was advertised as being student-led, it was noted there was a significant influence from a group that has been conducting weekly protests in our city. I think it's important to acknowledge that there were students present and that the subject matter or cause for these protests is very, very important to them. Student-led protests have been common throughout the generations and have contributed to social change in our country. It goes without saying that CPS is committed to upholding the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. That includes the right to protest. It also goes without saying that these very important rights are not absolute, and these activities must be carried out within the confines of the law. All to say that the Charter doesn't just provide us with rights to do things, but correspondingly it provides a responsibility to consider the rights of others while we do them. Our officers wanted to ensure that those participating were very clear about the laws governing their activities and the potential jeopardy they could face if they failed to comply with the trespass notice. What we absolutely did not want to have happen was for students to be charged either with trespassing offenses or worse, charged with a criminal offense, something that could impact their futures just because they didn't understand their rights and responsibilities or the steps that the police would ultimately take to clear this encampment. During this period, our officers were able to convince a good number of people to comply with the law and to leave on their own and to avoid an unnecessary confrontation with their police service. The reality of these protests is that there are people in the group who believe strongly in the cause and who even want to be charged. There are people who want to take their legal arguments before the courts, and in those cases, police are simply a conduit to allow them to be able to do that and to have their day in court to make those arguments. By about 8 p.m., it was clear that people who remained at the U of C encampment did not intend to comply with the trespass order. Officers then moved in to begin to clear the area. Some social media posts portray the process basically as starting from the very end. So what I mean by that is it's important to remember that social media or short video clips can often be taken out of context and don't provide the full story of what's happened in the lead up to actions that were taken prior to the enforcement action. It's on days like this that I'm reminded that police officers sometimes have a thankless job. This isn't something we enjoy doing, but it is something that is very necessary when individuals refuse to comply with lawful direction. I'm proud of the way that our officers handled themselves throughout the situation, working to educate, working to obtain voluntary cooperation, and ultimately escalating in tactics only in response to an increase in resistance. By the end, the quad was cleaned out and the encampment was removed. 5 individuals were arrested under the Trespass to Premises Act. 3 of them were issued violation tickets, and all were subsequently released. Further investigations will continue as we view video that gets posted and provided. Additional charges are possible, but unlikely in terms of anything particularly serious. I think that would have happened already if it was going to. There are no reported injuries either by officers or by anybody who was participating in the protest. Situations like this require considerable police resources to manage safely, and they do definitely impact our ability to ensure public safety and to respond quickly to emergencies around the rest of the city. Moving forward, we will continue to assist the university as required to remove any further encampments and to remove anyone else who has been trespassed and refuses to leave that property. We're hopeful that the individuals who do wish to continue to protest will do so lawfully and abide by the direction of campus security so that the police don't need to become involved in situations like this at all. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
We know that encampments like this have been popping up around Canada at other universities as well as in the U.S. I can't think of any other than maybe in Columbia, in New York, where it escalated, the police presence escalated to the point where Calgary did yesterday. What led to that escalation?
People refusing to leave. Again, it's really important, I think, to understand that these are taking place on private property. So it's up to the educational institutions, and some have positioned themselves differently in relation to how they would handle these things. I can tell you that I believe that the U of C's actually positioned themselves very fairly. They're encouraging, I wouldn't say encouraging, they're supportive of protests taking place, but just not encampments and occupations. And so I think if you've looked across North America, that's been problematic where that's been allowed to happen, but that's an individual decision. At the end of the day, there's many reasons why some institutions may take one approach and some might take another, and that's an individual choice. But I think at the end of the day, once the police are called and once people have been given hours of explanation about what's going to happen and about what their rights are in relation to remaining on that property, if you're not going to leave, the police are going to escalate and they're going to leave you. And that's what happened yesterday.
Were any of the 5 arrested students?
That I don't know off the top of my head.
From your description of the process, it sounds like you're describing them as largely peaceful. Is that correct?
So I would say largely peaceful to begin with. But it was clear non-compliant. Like at the end of the day, there were people in there, which you will know from interviews that have been done in mainstream media and also things that have been posted. There were individuals that were from the very start saying, we're not leaving. In the meantime, trucks are coming and they're bringing in pallets and fortifications. And so there was every indication there was a group of people that didn't plan to leave. So what's that, sorry?
So non-compliant.
Yeah, so not.
Well,
I would say that non-compliant to begin with, which is not necessarily not peaceful, but when the police went in finally to remove people from the encampment there were people that did actually become absolutely not peaceful. There were projectiles thrown toward the end of that. That's when the escalation happens at the end, where there's a small number of people that are throwing things and grabbing onto the police and that type of thing. And so, as I would expect, and as I'm happy to see, there was an escalation at that point because the behavior of the suspects will dictate the reaction of the officers as it did there, and that's how it works.
On site at the encampment, or anything dangerous that would have put members of public at risk?
I'm not aware of any specific weapons, Tiffany. When you talk about weapons, though, that can be anything. Like, I know I was very concerned to see the pallets going in there because, as you know, those things can be broken apart and used as projectiles. And I thought it was a very bad idea to let that go in there, but this was the first time this happened, and so we'll take some lessons away from that too. But if the university has been clear, as it had been, about the fact that there wouldn't be encampments on there, I think allowing those types of things to come in as fortifications, I think, is a bad idea, and we'll get that worked out between us.
Explain why you think it was appropriate for police to come in with tear gas and flashbangs?
Yes, because people were throwing projectiles at the police, refusing to comply with the lawful direction that had been given, and enough was enough. We'd been there long enough.
So is that the threshold? Enough is enough, we're just going to do it?
We're going to do it when we make the decision after we've given people enough time to be able to understand what the consequences are. If the members on the ground make the decision to clean it out and move them out of there, they're going to have to move. And if you throw things, or if you resist the police at that point, it will escalate, and it will escalate again.
There are critics that say that the police actually escalated the situation rather than the protesters by showing up in riot gear and then amounting to tear gas and these flashbangs. What's your response to that?
Hogwash. Does anybody else have any questions?
What kind of protesters there?
Sorry?
Any counter protesters there?
There was a small group of counter protesters there at some points.
Any problems with that?
No, that in terms of any decisions we made with respect to removing people from the location, the counter protest didn't play any part at all.
What do you, when you look at your officers, how worried are you for their safety in a situation like that?
Well, I think we always have to be aware that we have seen, like in crowd dynamic situations, you can see escalations where people begin to throw things and there can be weapons and that sort of thing. As it turns out, I mean, I would say that we were on this one fairly quickly and we didn't see that, but that is always a risk. We're going to make sure that our officers have proper protective equipment and stuff like that when we send them into those situations. I think that just makes common sense.
What kind of things were thrown?
I understand some bottles, and other than that, I don't know.
Plastic bottles or bottle bottles?
Bottles.
How are you able to determine that the counter-protesters were indeed counter-protesters and not bystanders?
As I mentioned, this sort of protest has been going on around the city for a while, or some of the same individuals. So some of the same counter-protesters were there as well. So really just recognition.
Chief, my experience is it's very rare to see any kind of non-lethal munitions used in a protest situation like this. I can't recall another situation. When's the last time that Calgary police officers have had to use non-lethal munitions at a protest?
Last time we did it would have been October 9th with the violence in Falcon Ridge here with the Eritrean community. We did there too. One thing I guess I would say about the use of non-lethal munitions, I think when people see videos and that type of thing, you think like, wow, because they make noise and stuff like that. But I pointed out before that there were no injuries to anybody involved in the matter. And so when you think about what is the alternative, our folks are very well trained and equipped in terms of crowd management. And so when you think of the alternative is to hit people with batons and stuff like that, which does cause injuries. The munitions that were used here on this particular occasion create distance. And so if you're standing right in front of me grabbing my shield and you don't want to move back, I can deploy munitions that will move you back in terms of using pepper spray or an irritant that would move you back. And when we create that space, we create safety for everybody. So I think when we look at the reasons we use these things, they're well thought out in terms of why they're done. And in fact, I would say they would be safer for people than the alternative.
Did you say 5 arrested and 3 charged?
Yes, 5 were arrested and 3 were charged.
How many officers roughly were involved in the response?
That's a good question. We can get you that information. I don't have it off the top of my head.
A few dozen or?
Oh, at least. Based on, yes, at least. Yeah, one of the things that happens in these situations in contemporary times, obviously, is people mobilize based on social media. So at the end of the day, we were well aware. We'll always have a little bit of information, stuff that we wouldn't discuss here about what's going on. And so groups have the ability to mobilize. And obviously, if they think the police are coming, obviously they'll try to mobilize because they know they can make it, that can be more difficult. So at the end of the day, there were efforts certainly to mobilize, and we made sure that we had enough resources to deal with whatever we would need to deal with there.
Obviously, fortifications being put up in the morning there, does that change the reaction from attending officers when something like this occurs?
Well, again, I think it just gives a little bit of indication regarding motivation and intent. So were we surprised that there was a group of people that were not going to leave? Not at all. The point of engaging people for as long as we did, though, was again to make sure that anybody who wasn't certain, anybody who had maybe been told something that wasn't quite right, had an opportunity to engage with officers before we ever went in to clean the place out. But let me be super clear. Anybody that was there at the end when those munitions were deployed were not surprised that they were deployed. Like, they had ample opportunity to leave. So if you were there at the end, you were there because you wanted to be, and you were not going to remain there.
Is this over, do you think?
Sorry?
Are your problems with the protesters, is it over?
Well, I don't know. Again, I think the university has positioned themselves, as I say, very, very fairly. I understand there's a protest going on now, and again, that's fair ball. The university's been clear that you can protest on university property. You just need to do that lawfully and not erect encampments and not occupy it. And again, I think that's super fair. And so as long as that doesn't happen, I think our problems are over. If it does happen again, our problems will continue.
How was that relationship with the University of Calgary? So as the night progressed, was there always that constant communication? Hey, like if this doesn't hit, then there might be that escalation of tactics. How was that relationship with the U of C all through the night?
Very positive. You talked to U of C about their perception of it, but I can say from our end, very, very positive. Again, I think that if we look at what happened in other schools in different jurisdictions, where encampments and occupations were allowed, at some point, a couple weeks down the road after everybody's gotten their headlines out of being there, then it has to escalate again in order to continue to do that because people seem to forget. And so in order to get that, then we've seen situations where monuments have been defaced, or there's been spray painting, or there's been steps taken to try to impact or interrupt graduations or whatever. That's certainly the case at the U of C. They've got graduations coming up here. And so they're naturally concerned about that. We also have seen in other locations where you have some students who don't feel safe because those protests have remained there full time. You have other students that don't feel safe because not everybody shares the view. And so at the end of the day, the university has a right or has a responsibility to create a safe environment for everybody that's on there. And so they're allowing people to come and protest. At the end of the day, if you don't share the view, you certainly can avoid that area of the university or whatever. And I think that's all quite reasonable. But the notion that it can actually become entrenched there. The other thing that I would say is, like the quad, is those are not serviced campsites. When you have people saying, we're going to stay here into perpetuity, and you provide demands, probably demands that are impossible to meet, how does this look in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month? You don't have to expand the boundaries of your mind too far to imagine what the problems can be in that area. And I guarantee you at the end, when you're talking about people who are unhappy with the owners of the property as it is now, they're not going to be super concerned about the cleanup and stuff like that. The university will be left with that. So once again, I think it's not unreasonable to say encampments and occupations are not on in the location that obviously is not suited for them. And so I think that's a very reasonable step to take, and again, will help out anytime they call in relation to this.
Chief, you said earlier that there were some protesters that wanted to be arrested. Is that something they told you directly, or how did you come to that knowledge?
No, we've seen that in other protests. It's actually fairly common where somebody wants to have a legal challenge with respect to a law, maybe trespassing, maybe those property-related laws. The only way they could do that would be to actually get arrested and go argue the pieces. During COVID, we saw that actually quite a bit, where people had certain groups that were actually funding their defense, and they actually wanted to be arrested so that they could go and make those constitutional arguments.
What time of day did the UNC reach out to CPS? Very early?
So we would have been aware fairly early. Like this was, I think, I don't want to say it was coordinated with Edmonton, but I'm not one that believes in coincidences. So around the same time, the U of A and the U of C had protesters pull in with similar sort of, ways of sort of establishing. So that was fairly early in the morning. That was like 6:30 in the morning that started.
You mentioned earlier about social media and how it can really muddle or change the narrative of an event such as last night. How difficult is it for you guys, and does that kind of sometimes come into play when you do know that escalation has to go? Because you're right, I mean, it's easy to show just all, the fancy shots, the flashbangs going off and all of that, but how does that affect your decision making when you know social media does have a play in how that narrative is told to everybody?
Well, I think what it has done is created an obligation and a responsibility for us to be able to be a bit more proactive with our own communications internally. Even today, I've seen elected officials commenting, I'm super concerned about what I saw. And again, that's the I guess advice or whatever that I would offer is to say, like, don't be taken in by a single snippet. Some of those folks there have the ability to reach out for actual information about what happened. And so again, we've got the next layer that takes to social media saying, I'm concerned about this, even though I know very little about it. So at the end of the day, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, and in particular leaders, to be able to say, let's just take a step back. I think as we go forward with artificial intelligence and generative AI and stuff that you guys know about, we're going to have to be even more careful in the future. But what I would say is I'm very proud of officers for the amount of time they spent. There is no question that they did not want to charge a bunch of people who didn't need to be charged, and they didn't do that. At the end of it, the quad was cleared, and we're in a better place. And like I say, we'll keep it in a better place.
Are you watching other jurisdictions?
Oh, we watch all the time, of course. Calgary is one of the largest municipalities in the country. And at the end of the day, we know we have a large population, we have a large activist community, and many people are concerned about the various geopolitical issues, whatever they may be, right? Because there's lots of them going on right now. So certainly we're watching around, not just around Canada and North America, but around the globe for what's happening, and taking any lessons that we can in relation to learnings even before to prepare or after about things that worked or things that didn't.
Conversations with some of the protest organizers going forward here to try to de-escalate further protests?
Oh, sure. Yeah. We'll never close the door with respect to our protest liaison teams and stuff like that. Like, we'll continue to. I don't think that the face of protests will probably change, and I think we've seen that, right? When we talk about the pro-Palestinian protests, like the what's happening in the Middle East has continued to change. And depending on what happens and what's said and policy issues and that type of thing, there is a reaction. And so I think we'll continue to see that as things go on, and we'll just need to deal with it. And we'll always keep the door open to speaking with people who want to protest in the city. Once again, we're supportive of that. But at the end of the day, we're only one half of the equation.
We saw that some individuals, organizers of some of these protests, were trying to de-escalate the situation beforehand, working with some of their members on the protest side to try to de-escalate things. How important was those efforts to maybe avoiding a larger tragedy?
Yeah, well, I think peer-to-peer, I think, is really important. And that's what I mean, like the idea of giving time and space for people to be able to talk to one another and to let things sink in and stuff like that, and talk with their peers, I think is really important. Somebody you trust, right? So I think that is very important. And so I think if anything for me, I would have thought we would have actually cleaned it out earlier. I would have liked to have done it before dark, frankly, but the people on the ground have command, and they're the ones that are there, and they will do what they think is right. But I can tell you this, it took extra time because they took extra time to allow opportunities for people to leave if they chose to do so. And the good thing was, by the time we ended up using munitions and having to go to that level, most of the people were gone.
Which munitions were used? I think you mentioned tear gas, but were rubber bullets used?
There were no rubber bullets used. No, there is a small munition that makes some noise that has some irritant in it, and that's the distance creator. There was also another munition called pepper. It's like a paintball. It's called pepper ball with a small amount of capsicum powder in it, which will also cause irritation, cause people to move.
Do you have an estimate of how many protesters were there when those were deployed?
I heard a small number. I think I heard 17, but that's about the most I can tell you.
And I know you said there was definitely dozens of cops there, but hundreds?
I don't think there's hundreds. They looked like a lot when I saw the cars and that type of thing. So it wouldn't have been hundreds, but certainly dozens.
And was police in riot gear kind of on standby until they were called in, or were they part of that first wave that came to the encampment?
I would say they were part of the first wave. Like, we wanted to make it very clear that we were going to clean out that encampment, and so they were there fairly early on.
I just want to actually feed off that question. There was a couple of people in the crowd, because it can be quite intimidating when you see police in full riot gear. Maybe if just a chance to speak on, like, what is the typical, like, if is that the typical response no matter what? Like, that would be the gear that they would be wearing, just so there's not that confusion to people on the amount of, because that's the thing, we're just seeing what they saw yesterday. Is that typical for that kind of event? That's what the CPS would be dressed in?
Yeah, I would say that's typical. Actually, what you're talking about there, the quote-unquote riot gear, is actually a step-down level from what actual riot gear is. There's much larger shields, and there's much more padding. So we've actually gone to a step-down layer, and people are still protected, but they're not looking as big and as intimidating as they would otherwise. I suspect for some it would look intimidating for sure, but I would just balance that off by saying if you're on the other side of situations like that, it's also provides some protection if you're out on the front, because we had a number of patrol officers there also. So if you have bottles or other projectiles that are flying, like if you're dressed as you are now, it's going to be a pretty uncomfortable place to be.